Since earliest times, humanity has been on the move. Some people move in research of new economic opportunities and horizons. Others move to escape armed conflict, poverty, persecution, terrorism, human rights violations. Still others move because of the effect of climate change and natural disasters. Many move indeed for a combination of these reasons. I am Irma Ginay, and this is Hijrah Podcast. This podcast is produced by IOM Regional Office. Dr. Khalid Koser is with me today to talk about violent extremism and migration. He is the Executive Director of Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, a public-private partnership dedicated to preventing violent extremism. Hello, Khalid.
Hi, thanks for having me.
There is a persistence to link migrants and violent extremism. Why does this persistence exist?
Well, firstly, thanks for asking the question. I think it's brave of you to even be addressing this topic. It's a politically sensitive topic. I think lots of people are concerned about making the link between migration and violent extremism, but I think it's a link that we have to think about because other people are making the link. I think often in an ill-informed way, but it's a link that's being made. I have a couple of observations on this question of the persistence of this link between migration and violent extremism. One is that it does seem to me that the discourse on migration and violent extremism focuses on just one aspect, which is the risk that migrants or displaced persons may become perpetrators of violent extremism, may perhaps be terrorists or violent extremists. And of course, that's a possibility. And history demonstrates that on occasion, some mobile populations do indeed engage in violent extremism. But equally, I think the evidence is clear that by far the majority of people who perpetrate violent extremism and terrorism are nationals of the country where they live. What we're missing when we have this discourse and discussion about violent extremism and migration are other linkages between these two topics. For example, violent extremism is often a reason why people leave their homes, especially refugees and internally displaced persons, but I think also some irregular migrants and even possibly economic migrants as well. So I think we need to widen our focus and realise that the link between migration and violent extremism isn't just about migrants being the perpetrators, but also perhaps they can be the victims as well. The second observation would be that this is a discussion that's taken place in the past. It's not a new discussion. I think what's new about it today is that perceptions no longer relate to realities. And I think actually this applies to migration more generally. There's a perception that migrants don't benefit host societies. Clearly they do, and the evidence is clear that they do. There's a perception that migrants don't integrate well. Clearly the evidence is that they do. And similarly, there's a perception that somehow migrants, and particular migrants, from a particular religious background or particular ethnicities or particular national origins, may be particularly inclined towards violent extremism. That's the perception. The reality is absolutely the other. So I think one of the challenges we have in this particular field, and also for migration more generally, is how we bridge the gaps between perception and reality. Exactly. And that's something we may wish to discuss. So answering your question about why this misperception appears to be so persistent at the moment, I mean, I can think of three reasons. One is I'm afraid that in some cases our political leaders are not being, I think, as responsible as they might be. And I think there's been a lack of political leadership over this issue for various reasons, appealing to the populist vote and so on. And this is the countries across the world, from European countries through North America to some countries in Africa and Asia as well. So I think we lack political leadership, which I think is an important element. I'm afraid, and I know this is a podcast, but I'm afraid that sometimes the media has not been as responsible, again, as perhaps it might be. I'm slightly old-fashioned about this. I see the purpose of the media as portraying to the populace the facts, the evidence, the details, and I think in some cases certain media outlets have a particular agenda, and I think that's regrettable. But I think the third reason why we have this persistence is that I think policymakers are failing to grapple with this issue. And this comes back to my earlier point about this being such a sensitive issue. For many policymakers, including in agencies like IOM and many UN agencies, this is such a politically sensitive topic. The idea to even mention or suggest that migrants or displaced persons might also become violent or extremist or criminal, and all of those negative connotations, which may be true in some circumstances, but even to suggest it, I think is anathema to many of these organisations whose mission is to protect and support migrants. And I think even in organisations like IOM and others, we need a slightly more critical, engaged discussion which recognises that in certain circumstances, very unusual circumstances, it may be that some migrants do turn to violence and extremism. It may be that some migrants do take advantage of the welfare state. It may be that some migrants don't contribute towards the economy. I think we have to have an honest discussion, always recognising that the truth is that in the vast majority of cases, migrants are positive.
And do you think, Khalid, that this presumed link between migrants and violent extremism might become an excuse to restrict migrants' movement?
I think it's already more than an excuse. I think we're seeing it used quite openly, again, by some policymakers and some politicians in a range of countries. I'm not pointing the finger at any particular country, to exclude migrants and even asylum seekers and possibly even refugees as well. I think there's a perception that national security comes before humanitarian obligations. And I think I probably agree with that assertion. But what I don't agree with is the suggestion that migrants and refugees pose a threat to national security. I think states have the right to protect their borders. I think states have the right to say who does and doesn't enter their country. I think states have the right to know who is in their territory and what those people are doing. But I don't think that there are large numbers of migrants who are in territories, who enter illegally and who are doing things that are not under control. So I think we are at risk of allowing national security concerns to trump or undermine humanitarian obligations, which I think is a mistake. So absolutely, the perception that migrants, asylum seekers and irregular migrants in particular, may be violent extremists or potentially violent extremists is certainly being used as an excuse to exclude them.
The association of migrants to violent extremism might put migrants' life in danger and hinder their integration process. Are there policies implemented by the states to address this challenge?
I think not sufficient policies at the moment. And I can give you a few examples of how migrants, perhaps lives are at risk, but certainly their dignity is at risk. One example would be where you have large numbers of migrants or displaced persons or refugees in camp situations. Now, at the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund that I run at the moment, we've done research in camp settings that find that there is a risk in certain camps that people may become radicalised, may become violent, and of course the reason shouldn't surprise us. It does seem to me that if you put large numbers of young people, and it's often young people, into a camp situation for an extended period of time with no clear future, with no clear direction, with no clear alternatives, then we shouldn't be surprised that in some cases a few of those people might become radicalised, might become tempted towards violence. I don't think that should surprise us, and I don't think that's a criticism of migrants and refugees. I think more generally the way that we risk warehousing people, not finding durable solutions for refugees, not dealing with the 1 million people who are currently in transit camps in Northern Africa, runs that risk. More generally, I think states through their discourse, again, policymakers through their inaction, media through, I think, sometimes their unfair portrayal of these issues, certainly affects migrants either directly or indirectly. Directly, as we've discussed, it may be that migrants can't get access to communities where otherwise they would have been able to, for risk of them being perceived as violent extremists. Indirectly, frankly, I think it's quite hurtful. I think to be a migrant who often comes from difficult circumstances, who has made an effort to come to a country, who is trying his or her best to integrate and to earn a living and to support a family, to be constantly opening the newspaper or turning on the television to find out that migrants are criminals or cheats or irregular, or must be fairly damaging to one's personality and one's character, I would have thought. I'm lucky enough not to be in that position. So I think we do need to think about the ramifications, both political and personal, of how we deal with this issue. Again, I'm unlike some people. Sometimes I think there may be a link between migration and violent extremism, and I'm certainly not here saying that we shouldn't have the discussion. But I think we should have the discussion in an informed and sensitive manner, and not in the generalised manner that's taking place at the moment.
I understand, but are there policies implemented already by the states?
I mean, lots of states would say, and I think I largely agree with them, that they have strong integration policies. So they are working to integrate newcomers, to integrate migrants. There's a challenge around irregular migrants. I mean, refugees in most states in the world, I think, do have basic rights. You could argue that some refugees are excluded from certain rights, but on the whole, I think refugees' rights are protected and respected.
It's a process of the recognition as well, which
absolutely.
It's a complicated one.
Yeah, but around this specific issue of the misperception of migrants and refugees, I don't think there's enough action at the moment. I don't think many policymakers are discussing it. And again, I think the IOM is quite brave in even having this podcast. I can imagine migrant rights activists criticising you for even criticising us for even having this discussion. And I think the line is that migrants have such a difficult life already. They are often moving from very difficult circumstances. Integration's challenging. There's high levels of unemployment. There's high levels of psychological trauma. And on top of that, we're even having a discussion that they might also be, to add further turmoil and suspicion to already difficult lives. I can understand why some people retreat from the discussion. My response to that has always been, whether you like it or not, this discussion is taking place. And it's taking place at the high level of politics and in media editorial rooms as we speak and amongst policymakers. Now the discussion is being had. I think it's up to people like you and me and sensible organisations like IOM to engage in the discussion and to make sure it's led in a sensible, informed manner. I'd rather we weren't having this discussion, but I think we have to have it now that the cat is out of the bag.
Yes. So going back to radicalisation, we could say that is a threat in any community, including transit and refugee camps, and you already mentioned it a little bit. What can we do to minimise the radicalisation?
I mean, I think there are
at least the risk of radicalisation.
I think there are two broad approaches. And again, this is a largely under-researched area. This isn't like health or education where we have 50 years of research and science behind it. We're still really trying to understand what's taking place. One answer, it seems to me, is to try to deal with the underlying causes that mean that some people find themselves tempted towards radicalisation and violent extremism. Now, those causes may be unemployment or inequality or marginalisation or discrimination. And note that all four terms I just used often apply to migrants as well.
Yes.
So there may well be a correlation between the migrant state and the migrant situation and some of the underlying causes that make people think they have no future, they have no options, they have no alternative but to become radicalised. So one, I think, stream of thought and stream of action is about trying to address those underlying causes. The other, clearly, is to think about how we deal with the, I think, very few but very important people and pulses and broadcasters who are generating hate speech, which means that young people who are already susceptible and already feel marginalised and already feel they have no future may be listening to a preacher or a podcast or reading social media that makes them think there may be an alternative. So it's some combination of the two, dealing with the source, but also making sure that people have some resilience, some critical thinking, some ability to listen to a podcast, think critically about it, and decide that actually it's not accurate, it's not sensible. Those are easy things to say, but very hard things to achieve. I think this is a major global policy challenge. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a big challenge around it. And I mean, you know this, but let's just be very clear for this podcast. I don't think this is about Islam. I don't think it's even about religion. This is about something more than that. Yes, there are some Islamic extremists. Yes, there's some religious extremists. Look at Buddhists in Myanmar, for example. Yeah. But often you find extremists who don't do this under a particular flag or a particular banner or a particular religion, but for other reasons as well. So recognising that, I think, is very important as well.
And I have a last question for you, Khalid. On your opinion, how a closer collaboration among states and policymakers is needed to protect both migrants and host communities?
Well, thanks for the question, and I'm pleased that you note the importance of protecting both migrants and host communities. The other risk of this discussion is to spend all of our time focusing on migrants and forget the host communities amongst whom they are living. Our organisation, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, is currently working, for example, on generating dialogue and understanding between host communities and the Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and making sure that those two communities can speak together and can overcome suspicions, and mutual suspicions, I think, is immensely important. I'm also grateful that your final question is moving us towards solutions. It's very easy in these discussions to spend a long time discussing the challenges and the problems. I think we have to be solutions oriented, and that's something I think the International Organization for Migration does very well. What I will say is, you've mentioned the importance of states and policyholders, policymakers. I think we must make sure that all of the relevant stakeholders are around the table having this discussion. I think it's about states. I think it's about the media. I think it's about organizations like yours, the IOM. I also think it's about the private sector. And I know there's a big push on the links between business and migration and business and human rights. I think the private sector has a vested interest in making sure that we get this debate correct. Migrants are an important market, an important source of labour for the private sector. The private sector also is clearly impacted by violent extremism. So I think the private sector should be interested in making sure we get this discussion right. And that ranges from mining companies to travel companies to, of course, social media companies that have, I think, a particular responsibility. We need to speak to civil society, if for no other reason, to safeguard against some of the misperceptions I've spoken about. You need someone in the room to remind you that migrants have human rights, and that we should always be remembering that. I think that's important. Most importantly, and I think I also absolutely credit IOM for doing this, we need to speak to migrants themselves. I think the risk of this debate and many other debates is that we sit in a room and speak about migrants rather than speaking to migrants.
And from Geneva, Switzerland, I'm Irma Jinai with
Khalid Koser.
And this is Hijrah Podcast. This podcast is produced by IOM Regional Office.